Hello, I'm back again with my Monday musings, filling in some of the gaps or incomplete thoughts from Sunday's sermon, or just adding things that there was no time to get to then. So I'm revisiting the thought resurrection power. Seems to me that if you're taking your cues from the Bible, that genuine discipleship demands that one be overzealous. Indeed, the scriptures have little that's positive to say about tempered, tepid, warmish, or unenthusiastic Christian living. In fact, the opposite is true. Jesus declared that the lukewarm are destined to be spewed out. The fact is, the lifestyle that Christ calls his followers to is, by all accounts, fanatical. It's outrageous. It is, by all accounts, extreme. He calls those who are his to live lives of total devotion and undivided loyalty. Discipleship on the Lord's terms, it's radically countercultural. And by that I mean that he asks us to live in the world in a way that is so far out of step with the way of being that society sanctions, trains us in, or models for us, that it is literally shocking. So far out of step with the inclinations of our fallen nature that it unnerves the flesh to even think about it. So I'll say it again. Discipleship to Christ is radically countercultural. That is, if it's genuine. The Lord maps out his extraordinary vision for kingdom living throughout the Gospels. But the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7 features an especially a high concentration of Christ's teaching on the matter. David Lipscomb called the Sermon on the Mount the moral code of the Christian dispensation, articulating the great principles of the kingdom of God. You know, even a simple, thoughtful read of those 3 chapters of Matthew reveals that a kingdom lifestyle completely subverts the interests, values, and priorities of popular culture, of the world. And they do so to such an extent that kingdom or Christian living, as the Lord presents it, turns out to be a veritable inversion or turning upside down of the world's way of living. If you're born again, Jesus is your rightful absolute sovereign. And as your king, he expects that your fealty to him will be displayed as loyal obedience to the government, to the laws, and to the ordinance of his kingdom, as he has laid them out in the Gospels. For example, and this is just a partial list, Jesus says, love your enemies. He says, when someone actually or metaphorically slaps you in the face, don't slap back. Turn the other cheek and let them slap the other one too. He says, forgive people. No matter how often they offend you, just keep forgiving them. He says, go the second mile. If someone makes unjust demands of you or asks too much of you, meet their demands and do more than that. Do more than they demand. Go the second mile. He says, God or money. You have to choose between them. He says, you can gain the world or have real life, but not both. He says, don't make the things of this life your concentration or focus. Instead, focus or concentrate on God. He says, become a servant. He says, sell your stuff and give to the poor. He says, you have to deny yourself. And you got to take up your cross daily and follow him. He says, put me ahead of everyone else in your life, even your closest family members. He says, rejoice when you're persecuted. He says that we are to recognize that he is the only way to God. He said, blessed are the poor in spirit. He says, blessed are they who mourn. He even says, expect the world to hate you. And just deal with it. More than a few believers over the millennia of Christian history have found the Lord's expectations, those I mentioned and others, to be daunting, even overwhelming. They felt that the call to live Christianly in the world was more than they were capable of. And because of that, there have been a number of responses to the way that Jesus articulates in the Gospels. Some Christians have taken the view that the thing to do is to simply deal with Christ's radical demands by rushing past them with eyes closed. Don't even acknowledge them. Just ignore them. Simply overlook them. And then live something that passes for a good life based on your own standards and call it Christian. Others have chosen to confront the Lord's demanding sayings or to confront head-on his radical statements, and they fully acknowledge them. But they creatively interpret them so that they don't mean what they say, so they don't actually ask what they actually do, so that they're not as demanding after all. You know, as it turns out, those two responses are actually, in a measure, rooted in clear thinking. The feeling that living Christianly in the world, or being the way Jesus wants us to be, is a larger challenge than we can handle is really quite an accurate assessment of affairs. We can't. We can't be what Christ wants us to be in our own strength. The fact of the matter is that it's the person who tells himself, I got this, I can handle this, I can make this happen, all on his or her own strength. That's the person who's got it wrong. You see, it takes more than willpower to rise to the Lord's expectations and to rise above the baser impulses of human nature. However, that being said, while those two responses are rooted in a measure in clear thinking, they are also anchored in faulty believing. In particular, they fail to realize that Jesus also understands that we're not up to the task of living into his kingdom expectations. And that's why 2 Peter says his divine power, his resurrection power, has bestowed on us absolutely everything necessary for a dynamic spiritual life and godliness. That's why the power that raised Christ from the dead dwells in you and dwells in me. It resides there to make an otherwise impossible way of being in the world, of living in the world, possible. You know, the Apostle Paul was a man who aspired to a life that conformed to the Lord's expectations. But he was also acutely aware that doing so was a greater challenge than he could handle on his own. So this is what he wrote. He said, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. You see, the apostle aspired to be much more than simply saved. He aspired to living in the world in a manner that pleased God, that brought glory to his name, and that influenced others to want to choose Jesus in their lives. For that reason, he indicates that besides knowing Jesus, he wanted to experience Christ's resurrection power unleashed and operational in his life. He wanted to know in an experiential way the power of Christ's resurrection. He wanted to experience the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, surging through his own life, overcoming sin, and producing the Christian graces in him. I said it yesterday morning. I'll say it again. Resurrection power, the same power that raised Christ from the dead, residing in you, is a game changer. And it's also absolutely necessary. God bless you.